everybody, it's Cam here with Easy Work Acres, and we're back in the garage, this time making some worm compost buckets. So the goal with this is basically to try and attract more worms to our garden beds. Like I said in previous videos, we had some knockout garden beds that didn't do well, so we've done a lot of soil prep and preparing this garden bed this year. And one of the things I've had a lot of interest in over the last year or two, but just never got around to starting, is trying to do some kind of worm composting bin. And while trying to figure that out, I came across a couple people with the idea of doing bins just straight up in the ground. So attracting worms that are already existing instead of trying to start a worm farm in some big bathtub or something and order them online and everything else, is to try and attract the worms that are already existing in our land and trying to draw them in towards our garden bed. So that not only is that going to attract them to our garden bed, but we're also going to be creating worm castings so that we can amend the soil throughout the garden with what we collect in these buckets here. So basically all you need is 5-gallon buckets and lids. I just dumped pickle juice on myself. So these are pickle buckets. We used these in another video, I can't remember which one, but basically we just got these buckets. They're very cheap, it just has like the plastic handle on it. They're pickle buckets from a local restaurant. We just basically went in there and was like, hey, do you have any leftover buckets? Yep, and they gave us some. Now some had lids, some didn't. We already used the lids that we had for the chicken nesting boxes. That's what we use these for in our greenhouse. But you can pick up lids for buckets. If you have buckets around that you don't have any lids for them, you can pick up buckets at Lowe's or Harbor Freight or any place like that, and they all fit the same. A 5-gallon bucket fits a 5-gallon bucket lid. So I'm using my cheap buckets instead of my nice ones that have like an actual metal handle, because I use them for all kinds of stuff around the farm. But all you're going to be doing is, I'm using a 1/2-inch drill bit, giving plenty of room for the worm to be able to get in and out, and you're just drilling holes all around this thing. Now you're only doing it like as far down as you're going to leave the opening at the top. So like I'm leaving about this much above the ground, basically the bottom of where this handle attaches above the ground, and then the rest will be in the ground. So I'll have holes all over the place in this thing, and then you just load it down with compostable material, things that worms eat. So gonna start off by drilling in some holes. I'm using a 1/2-inch bit, basically just drilling holes all over the place. So I'm gonna run through, smack all these holes in here all the way around and on this bucket too. And then we'll move outside and get this thing in the ground, and then we'll move on to loading it down with the compostable material. Alrighty, so I have drilled out this bucket, so you can see I got holes just randomly all over the place on this thing. And they, for the most part, there wasn't any real rough burrs or anything, and what I found is the ones that did, it was definitely easier to just clean this up with a utility knife versus using like a file or something. But got the buckets drilled out and everything, and we are about to go out and put them in the ground and then start filling them up with some compostable material. So let's do it. All right, so the first place I wanted to add one of these buckets was in the middle of this long raised bed here. And hopefully, you know, this helps out all the raised beds, because the worms aren't only just gonna stay here, they'll travel around, come back, come and go and stuff like that. So we're gonna put one right in the middle of the big one. So digging a hole here, and then we're gonna add one, for now just one, to the in-ground bed over here. I plan on actually adding two, one on each end of the bed. That will hopefully get a bunch of worms traveling back and forth between all of these garden beds. So let's get to digging. All right, so just wanted you to be able to see like kind of the depth I'm working with here. So with this specific one, I didn't go too deep in the ground because this raised bed, I'm going to obviously be building this up all the way to this point right here. So a little shallower in the raised bed specifically. I mean, if you're working with a really tall raised bed, obviously you're just working the depth depending on what you're working with. So half of this is gonna be in the ground, part of this is gonna just be in the raised bed part, but either way will work, as long as you don't have like some thick plastic barrier under your raised bed or something like that. Mine is just right on top of the dirt. So I'm going to be backfilling this, and then we plan on continuing to add to this even as it starts to lower down, all the way up until this like lower ridge right here. So the whole stop just below this handle. I'm gonna be putting dirt right up to here, and then we will move on to adding in the material. Alrighty, so we got this bucket here backfilled and everything. So as you can see, like dirt is all the way to the holes on all of these. So you do want to pack it in good because worms aren't going to just travel through nothing. You want that dirt all the way pressed good against that bucket. And like I said, I made the top of the bucket pretty much level with the top of the raised bed. Now we're going to add in some material. All right, so one of the main things with the worm bins is it basically follows the same rule of like a compost bin. You want to make sure there's browns and greens that you're adding in because you don't want to create like this anaerobic environment where it's like smelling bad. And I've made this mistake before. At our previous house, I started a compost bin and I threw in a bunch of grass clippings. They were just fresh green, added too much, and it just smelled absolutely terrible. It seemed like my compost pile was like rotting. So same rules apply for the compost bin. So you can add newspaper here. I basically just brought this out here as like an example, but I have leaves all right here. So basically I'm just gonna add a bunch of leaves to the bucket, and that will be my browns. Like, so these are dried leaves, obviously. It's well into January, fall happened a long time ago. So adding in some of that, I'm going to add in some of this manure, pretty much anything you would add to a compost bin. And you want to treat it that way all the way through this bucket's life cycle. So you're checking this thing regularly. One of the things that I've watched on this, and like I said, I got this idea from a YouTube video. So one of the things that was mentioned in several of the videos is checking this pretty regularly to make sure that it stays wet inside. So you don't want it soaking wet, but you don't want it to dry out because worms need moisture to be able to survive or even be in here. Along with like all this composting material, like this is just like literally table scraps. Like this is from a spaghetti squash. You can throw all this stuff in here. What you don't want to throw in is any type of meat product, dairy product, anything that's really oily or anything like that. And something else that is helpful specifically for the worms is just like chickens, grit, like eggshells, are very helpful for their digestive. It's like it helps them digest the food. So all of these scraps, that's a whole onion, but we're gonna throw it in anyways. We have a lot of eggs and things like that. So I'll be crushing up eggshells and adding that to this material as well. So that's all there is to it, is adding in this material, greens, browns, some kind of grit, and you want to continue adding that stuff every time you're checking it. So like when it's starting to work its way down, the worms have like knocked out an entire bucket and you get all your worm castings out, you keep amending it with more grit, more browns, more greens, not just only adding your table scraps, because you don't want it to become just nasty, bad smelling stuff that the worms can't work with. So like I said, I'm gonna be putting in multiple buckets. I'm just gonna show the video of doing this one because once you've done one, you can do a bunch of them. But the point in doing multiple, not only to get the worms to be traveling to different buckets throughout our garden, but also is they're gonna work one bucket down, and while this one's getting worked and becoming worm castings, I can start adding material to another one so that when they're done with this one, they'll move on to the next one, and when they're moved on to that next one, I can get all the castings out and start this one over fresh. So that's the plan, at least. We'll see how it goes. We'll come back and basically give you a follow-up of how it goes. If we get any worms in this thing or not. This might not work at all, but hopefully it does. So we'll be doing a follow-up video in a couple months in the spring, hopefully. Hopefully by spring we'll have worms just rocking this thing and creating worm casting for us. So that's all I got for you. Like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you next time.